Good morning, everyone. Thank you for tuning into this session today. My name is Jody McLaughlin. I'm a technical support engineer with Informatica, and today's demo I'm going to be covering how to use SCIM integration with Microsoft Azure for intelligent data management cloud. SCIM is a provisioning feature which allows for user access management in Informatica Intelligent Cloud Services. It allows you to synchronize users and groups from Azure Active Directory or Microsoft Entra ID as it's now known. And it allows you to be able to control access to IDMC using your Active Directory or Microsoft Entra directory as a key controller for user access management. So to present today what the agenda is, it's basically a tutorial on how to configure IDMC with Azure Entra ID, or as I said, Active Directory. And it's to allow you to provision users and groups from Microsoft Azure Entra ID into IDMC, into an org, and to control your users and groups and the permissions that they have been assigned within IDMC. So we will explore as part of this how to create an Azure application with SAML. We'll go through the steps on how to create a couple of users and groups in Azure and roles for an application in Azure and how to assign those. We'll also look at exporting and importing the federation metadata between Azure and the SAML app and the IDMC SAML setup screen. We'll look at also a bit at mapping the relevant attributes that we need between IDMC and Azure Entra or Active Directory, just to ensure that the user accounts get created in IDMC, and also how to maintain them for any further changes that might be made to the users or the groups or the roles for that matter. And then we'll also look at essentially the steps required for provisioning in Azure, which is the process for pushing out changes to IDMC or a third-party application. So that is the agenda for today. And without any further delay, I'll move on to the first step. Okay, to start, we're going to create an Azure SSO application that's going to be used for integrating with IDMC. So to begin, I'm going to log into Azure and we will continue from there. Okay, so in Azure, in order to create our application, what we want to do is open the Microsoft Entra ID page. This will just bring us to an overview page. And down the left-hand side of your screen, you should have the option for enterprise applications. If you click on that, then from the screen, we will get a list. Currently, there's no applications. So here we're going to select the plus icon that says new application to add a new application. And from the next screen, we want to select create your own application. On the right-hand side of the screen, we'll be prompted to put in a name of the app. So I'm just going to give this one Infa IDMC and select the default option, integrate any other application you don't find in the gallery, and just click create. Okay. Once the application has now been created, if you select the single sign-up option on the left-hand side of the screen, this will open a new window, and we want to select the SAML option here from the list of the 4 options. Once you have selected that option, you'll now be presented with a configuration screen for the actual SAML application. So at this point, what we want to do is we actually want to upload the metadata federation file from IDMC. So if we open IDMC and go to the SAML setup screen, we should have an option in the top right-hand corner of the screen to download service provider metadata. If you click that button, it will download a file, and then you can return to Azure and use the upload metadata file option and upload that XML file that you just downloaded. And click Add. Once done, you'll get a pop-up screen on the right-hand side, which will just include the identity ID, or the entity ID, sorry, for the application. And also the likes of the reply URL will be populated. The sign-on URL you can actually get from this screen in IDMC. So the pop-up window, you can copy that URL and paste it into Azure. If you close the previous dialog screen, just click on the download service provider metadata option again, and it'll pop up and you'll be able to copy it. And the relay state, you can leave as blank. Logout URL should automatically also be populated. So after all that's completed, just click Save. Okay, once that's done, we'll click No, I'll test it later. We're testing the application. Next thing we want to do is we want to edit the attributes and claims here and add an additional claim for the group. So if you click Add a Group Claim, and then select from the option on the right-hand side of the screen, All Groups, and save that option. We should now be present with a claim name here for the groups, which we'll explore later actually in the presentation. If you go back again now to the application, and just open it, go back into the single sign-on option, we should now see the additional claim for the group. Okay, the second step is to create our users and groups, which you may already have in your Active Directory or in your Microsoft Azure account. But for the purposes of the demo, I'm going to create a couple of users and groups to assign those to the application that we just previously created. So I'm going to switch back to Azure now to show this part of the demo. Going back into our Microsoft Entra section of Azure, we will see down the left-hand side of the screen 2 options, users and groups. If you click into users, I currently have 1 user in there. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up 1 user as an administrator for the IDMC application, and another separate user that's only going to be a governance user. So if you click Add New User, and we'll call this user admin, and we will give this user a separate password. And I'll click Review, and just check for any validation failures. So I need to put in the display name. So I'm going to put in admin for that. And once validation is cleared, I can successfully create the user. So I'll call this user admin, and then I'll create another user, call it governance user. And again, I'll give it just the name governance user and create an individual password for it. And click create. Okay. Okay, now that those 2 accounts both exist, I'm going to create a group. So I go back to Microsoft Entra ID, and under groups, I'll click New Group, and I will give this group the name Administrators. And I will select my own personal account as the owner. And as a member of that account, I will assign the admin user. Click Create. Okay, once that's created, I'll create another group. I'm just going to call this IDMC users. And I will assign same owner from before. And this time I will assign the IDMC, sorry, the governance user to the IDMC users group. Okay, save that. Okay, now I have my two groups and my two users. So what I want to do is now if I go back into the home screen, back into Microsoft Entra ID, go back into Enterprise Applications and open the application in Azure. If you select from the tile Assign Users and Groups, or even from the side of the screen here, the left-hand side, you want to add essentially the users and the groups that we just created there now. So I'm going to select here, add assignment, and I will select the administrators group, the governance user, the admin, and the IDMC users group. So add the 4 objects and assign. So now what you notice from the screen is we have the administrators group, the governance user, which is a user, an IDMC users group, and an admin user. So you'll notice also at the side of the screen here, we have this section called role assigned. So this will be used as part of the role mappings in IDMC to Azure roles. So if we wanted to give our users specific roles in IDMC that were mapped to, or if you want to give a user a specific role in Azure that's assigned to an IDMC role, then we would need to configure specific types of roles. So in this case, what I'm going to do is for the administrator group, I'm going to create a role as admin, and I'm also going to assign our admin user as an admin to the admin role as well. So if I click edit assignments, sorry, application registration. So here there's an option that says assign users and groups to app roles for your application here. To create new app roles for this application, use the application registration. So if you click on that, it'll bring you into another screen where we'll be able to actually create the application roles. So I'm going to click create app role, and I'm going to type admin as the role. I'm going to select from this list both users, groups, and applications. I'm going to give it a value of admin, and I'm going to put in this is the role for admins in IDMC. Ensure the tick box is checked so that you can enable the role for use in the application and click apply. For the governance user role, I'm going to create another role as well. We'll just call it users. And we'll give it the value users as well. And this is for governance users. So we'll do the same thing. Okay. Now we've got the two roles essentially enabled here. So I'm just going to go back to my user list again with my groups and associate the correct mappings for the roles. So if I go back here, and for administrators, I'm going to click edit assignment. And for the group, for the administrator, I'm going to assign, to wait to refresh a bit. Come back. Just refresh the screen. So select the administrators group. Oh, sorry. Administrators group, click edit assignment, and select from the roles. I'm going to select admin. Click assign. Now the IDMC users, I'm going to select that one. Oops. Again, select it using the checkbox, click edit assignment, and we'll select it to our custom role for users, which is this one, lowercase users. Okay.
Okay, so I'm gonna see if these settings as it is. Whenever I assign, I'll map the group to the in IDMC to the administrator role in IDMC. And I'll then also assign the IDMC users group to the governance user in IDMC, and the users mapping here, the role mapping will be assigned to the governance user role in IDMC as well. So we'll cover that in the later stage, but step 3 we're now going to move on to, which is importing the metadata configuration from the Azure app into IDMC.
Okay, third step is to import the configuration of our newly created application in Azure into the SAML setup page in IDMC. So I'm going to switch back to Azure again, and I'll explain the steps on how to do that. So if you click on Microsoft Entra ID, in the next screen, let's open the enterprise applications and open our Info IDMC application that we previously created. In here, if we go into the single sign-on page from our application configuration, if you go to section 3, which says SAML certificates at the top, there is an option here for Federation metadata XML. If you download that file and click keep, then if we move back into IDMC under the SAML setup page, let me just refresh the screen. In the screen, you will have the option to use an identity provider file. So from the drop down, what I want to do is just select file for import. And it should update the issuer field, single sign-on service URL, and the sign-in certificate. So you should be able to now select save. So in the top right-hand corner of your screen, if you just click that button, that will complete the import of the actual Federation metadata. Okay, we're on step 4 now, and we need to enable the SCIM settings in IDMC. So in order to do that, I'm going to switch back to the IDMC administrator, and I'll show you the next steps on how to do that.
Okay, so the step is to essentially enable provisioning for IDMC. So if you see, after we've imported the metadata Federation XML file, we have our issue, our single sign-on service URL and signing certificate. What we want to do is now enable the provisioning of users here in IDMC by selecting the following checkboxes. So we click Disable Auto Provisioning of Users and Map SAML Groups and Roles. Tick both of these, and then you'll get a separate option to enable IDP to push users groups using SCIM 2.0. So if you tick that option, you'll then be able to generate essentially a token, which will be passed to the provisioning tool in Azure, which we'll cover in the next step. So I'm getting prompted here because an existing token already exists. I'm going to select yes to overwrite. So when I select yes, I will get a token. You need to copy this token and make note of it. And we will import this token into Azure in the next step.
Okay, step 5, we configure provisioning in the Azure SSO application. So this will be the tool that's essentially going to push our users and groups out to IDMC. So to walk through those steps, I'm going to switch back now into Azure.
Okay, so in this section, we're going to configure provisioning in Azure. So I'm going to open my application again in Azure, and I'm going to select on the left-hand side of my screen the option for provisioning. When we click on that option the first time the application, it will give us a wizard that will walk us through the steps of configuring provision. So I'm just going to click the Get Started button. Okay, the next screen will give you an option to either use manual provisioning or automatic provisioning. Automatic provisioning runs every 40 minutes. It cycles through changes made to the user profiles, groups, relationships between the groups and users, and any new users that have been added or users that have potentially been deleted, and it provisions the following changes and pushes them to IDMC. In this case, in this example, we're just going to go with the automatic option. So if I select automatic, I'll be presented with two drop-down menus. So we're going to cover for the admin credentials. What we'll do is we need to give a tenant URL. This URL will depend on which region your IDMC service is, in which region your IDMC service is running. For purposes of this exercise, I'm using a pod that's based in Europe. But if you were using, for example, the US pod, you would use DM-US. So as I said, in this example, I'm going to be using DM-EM. If you have any doubts to this URL, just open a support ticket with GCS and we'll try to get confirmation on which one to use. The secret token, as I mentioned before, you'll get in previous step of the tutorial under the IDMC configuration. For the SAML setup, you would need to generate the token. Once you have that token, copy it and paste it into this screen, and then click the test connection. And we'll try it one more time. DM-EM. Oh, the reason it's not working is because I haven't saved the changes here. So once you regenerate the token, you have to click save and then test the connection, and you'll see the test connection is valid. For these settings, we're just going to leave them as they are and just click save.
Step 6, we now need to map the relevant attributes between Microsoft Entra ID and IDMC. This is just to ensure that the relevant details are passed between Azure and IDMC in order to set up our users and also to update our users following subsequent refreshes of the user accounts and groups for any permission related changes or any users getting added into groups, etc. So I'm going to switch back into Azure again.
Okay, so this section we're going to cover the attribute mappings in Azure to map attributes from Azure to our IDMC application. So we're going to continue by opening the application that we were working on from before, and we're going to go to the provisioning tab of the application in Azure. So from the provisioning screen, you'll see there's an option for edit attribute mappings. So if you click on that, and then you'll see 3 drop-down options, admin credentials, mappings, and settings. We want to select the mappings drop-down. And from here, we're going to open this hyperlink, provision Microsoft Entra ID users. Okay, so in this screen, what you're going to see is essentially the attributes from Microsoft Entra and how they are actually mapped across to our custom app SSO, which is essentially the IDMC application. We're going to add a couple of additional attributes to this list just to ensure that our roles are correctly transferred across to the IDMC application from Azure, and also for locale and time zone settings to ensure that they're also included as part of the build of the user's profile. So at the bottom of the screen, you're going to see an option for show advanced options. So if you please check that. And then down below, you should see then a option to edit the attribute list for the custom app SSO. So if we click on that hyperlink, we'll be brought to a new screen. If you scroll to the bottom, we want to add in here a attribute called roles, and it's important to ensure that it matches exactly the same case as that, just as that is what the IDMC application is expecting to receive a attribute value for. We also want to ensure that the property multi-value is selected for that attribute because you can have multiple roles to a group or a user. So please tick that box and then save the attribute list. Okay. So once that's done, we're now going to actually map to our roles attribute. So we're going to create a new attribute mapping, and we're going to select expression from the mapping type list. From here, I'm going to add a custom expression.
which essentially paste it in here. So it's app, role, assignments, complex, open brackets, and then in square brackets, put app, role, assignments. And essentially, that's going to parse out the list of roles that we have. You should see a message that the expression is correctly parsed. And then the target attribute you want to select is the one that we just created, which is roles. Once that's done, click OK and save. And we're going to now add 2 more attributes. So we'll add constant values for these attributes. So the first one we're going to select is the locale. And I'm going to put in here EN US. Of course, you can put in whichever value you want to use, but that'll be the locale that I'll specify just for the purpose of the presentation. So I'm going to select OK and save that. And then the last mapping I'm going to add as a constant value as well is for the time zone. So I'm based in GMT hours, so I'm going to add GMT and click OK. So that concludes the mapping list. I'm just going to save the list and the changes that we've just made. And then we will move on to the next step. Step 7, we're now at the stage where we need to map the groups and roles that we just created in step 2 to the roles in IDMC. So in order to do that, I'm going to switch back to IDMC and I'm going to walk through that in further detail. Okay, so we have completed the section on mapping the attributes in Azure. The next step is to map the attributes within IDMC for the roles and also for the groups, which is this section at the bottom right-hand corner of my screen. Essentially, what you'll see is all of the roles within IDMC, and then we can associate them with roles from Azure. And the same applies with the SAML group mapping tab, where we can associate the IDMC roles with the Azure groups that we created earlier. But before we do this, we need to add a couple of additional SAML attributes here at the top of the screen. So for the user groups, we will need to populate the attribute that was created earlier in the SAML app configuration. So if I go back into Azure and open Microsoft Intra, and I'll open the enterprise applications and into my application again. On the left-hand side of the screen, I'm going to select the single sign-on option. And then I'm going to click the attributes and claims. I'm going to click the edit pen so that we can capture the correct attributes. So here was the groups attribute that we created earlier, and the name that was given for the claim is this http schemas.microsoft.com. So we want to copy that, and under the user groups option in IDMC, we're going to paste that value. And then for the user roles, we want to put in the attribute roles, which is what we created in the provisioning mapping earlier for the additional attributes. So once that's done, click Save to apply the configuration. And then what we will do is now we will map the actual roles and the groups from Azure to the roles in IDMC. So I created a role earlier, and I'm going to go back to check the details of the roles for the application. So if I open the application and go to users and groups, I can see my 2 roles again. So there's admin and users. So I want to assign the admin role in IDMC to the admin role that was configured in Azure. I then want to do the data governance user, which is governance user, and the, oops, sorry, I'm on the wrong tab. Make sure to do it in the right tab. So SAML role mapping, that will be admin to admin, and for the governance user, I will put in users as the role. And make sure you get rid of any leaving spaces in case they get put in. So for the groups tab, the admin, we want to assign the administrators group from Azure to the admin role. So I'm going to type in administrators. And then for the governance user, the group we're going to use is IDMC users. So I'm just going to type in IDMC users. And you can do this for then however many roles in Azure you have and however many groups in Azure you have. That pretty much concludes what we need to add now for the role mappings in IDMC. So then the next section is ultimately to provision now the users into IDMC. So we'll cover that in the next section. Step 8, we're now at the stage of actually provisioning our users. So this is the step which involves synchronizing the users and the groups from Azure into IDMC. So I'm going to switch back again to Azure and I'm going to trigger the provisioning and then I'll show the user creation in IDMC. Okay, so this is the last section on the provisioning. So what we're going to do now is actually do a trigger of the provisioning run so that we can actually synchronize our users and our groups and our roles into IDMC. So from this screen, we're going to click Start Provisioning. Once the provisioning is scheduled to start, there will be an original init. So if you click Refresh, you'll see what we got. Initial cycle completed, 100% complete, provision 2 users and 2 groups. So if I go back into IDMC and I click on our user groups, we can now see our administrators group and our IDMC users group. And if we go into our users tab, we can see our admin at Outlook, SCIM. This is the first user, and then also the governance user, which is below. You can also see the group has been associated correctly, administrators has been given, and the admin role has been given. And for the governance user, the IDMC users group is associated, and the governance user role is associated as we were expecting. So you can also see as well, there's the status on these users is pending activation. So upon first logging in as the user, these user accounts will actually get activated. What I'm going to show you is actually how to activate them and test the login in the very next step, in the final step. Okay, step 9 is the final step. It's not a mandatory step, but it's a useful way of validating that the configuration is working as expected. So we're going to use a test utility in Azure on our Azure application in order to activate one of the user accounts that we just created. And it can be used essentially to test for any issues with specific logons for a specific user account. So we'll be using that test application in Azure. So I'm going to switch back again to Azure now to take a final look at that. Okay, so I'm back in IDMC again. So what we're going to do here is activate this account, the admin at outlook.scim.onmicrosoft.com. Currently it's showing up as pending activation. So what we need to do is just log out of the current account that we have in IDMC, so as not to cause any conflicts whenever we try to log in with the SSO user. If we close this window and go back to Azure, next we're going to go and open the application again. We're going to go to the single sign-on screen and we're going to click Test This Application button at the top of the page. That will expand another screen and we're just going to click the Test Sign In button. So now we'll get an option for which account we want to log in as. I'm going to select the admin at Outlook scim.onmicrosoft.com. Once I click on that, we should be redirected into the Informatica IDMC platform. So now I click continue, and we get to our landing page, and we can check if we open up the administrator console. That's the user account that we're now currently using in this organization is our admin at Outlook scim.allmicrosoft.com. So we know the user account's now been properly activated, and you can see the status flag has changed to enabled. So this concludes the digression piece for between Informatica IDMC and Azure SCIM. This point in the demonstration, we've completed the setup for our provisioning of users to IDMC. There are a couple of additional points and considerations that I do want to share in this presentation. One of them being regarding what data is actually populated across to IDMC. So if I actually look at our user account that we just provisioned, which is the administrator account, it's, as I said, it's enabled from the previous step we conducted in step 9. But if you open the account, you'll see that there are certain attributes that are actually missing values, the likes of the first name, last name, job title, phone number, etc. And there's some extended attributes as well, in which case these are all blank. Now, whilst these aren't mandatory attributes, in most cases, you probably would want them to be populated for the user. In Azure, what typically happens is if the attribute value isn't present or is null, then it won't pass that SAML attribute to IDMC. And so the expectation here is that the values for the likes of these fields will be blank. As part of the presentation, what I wanted to share is the fact that it will only propagate, the provisioning will only propagate the data for which attributes that it has. Furthermore, the provisioning logs in Azure will not showcase to you that a value for a specific user or a group for a attribute is unavailable. In other words, if there's a null value, it won't tell you that. It'll just simply skip provisioning for that specific attribute. Okay, so if we skip back to Azure for a second, if we open the admin profile for our admin user and click on Edit Properties, you're going to see here that the first name field is actually empty. And so is the last name, the job title, the company name, department name, and so forth, so on and so forth. So in the case that we decided we want to put in the first name here for the administrator, maybe it's Joe Blogs or something like this here. And you save that. Then if you provision that user again from our SAML application, we'll keep the provision on demand. I'm going to put in the admin user and provision. This time you'll see that the actual attribute field has been identified as being populated, and it pushes that out into IDMC. So now if I refresh the screen for the admin user in IDMC, and I'll open the user again, what you'll notice is the actual first name has actually been populated this time. So it's important to recognize that what Azure provisions depends entirely on the information that's available in Azure. So you should ensure that all relevant fields for your users or your groups are populated prior to performing the provisioning. But as I said, it's additional functionality or additional attributes that can be added. They're not mandatory as part of the user creation. Okay. So as I said, provisioning logs can reveal if there's any issues when creating a user or group accounts in IDMC, which you can see from the provisioning logs I just showed you. Automatic provisioning will run every 40 minutes from Azure, which pushes any updates or changes to users, groups, or roles from Azure out to IDMC. And the manual provisioning can also be performed on demand to push changes, which is what we just did for the admin user. It's also important to note that in Azure, there is a account status flag, which tracks whether a user account is enabled or not in IDMC also. They are connected with one another. So if I go to our Azure portal again, and I go back into my users, and I'll open the admin user account. If I decide I want to disable this user, I click Edit Properties. I'll go to the settings screen and I'll uncheck the account enabled flag and save that. If I then provision that user once again, so I go to the application and provisioning, and I go provision on demand. If I say the admin user again and click provision, this time what you're going to see is the source attribute value for if the account is enabled, it's detected that it's false. And so that's the modified value that's pushed out to IDMC. So if I go to the administrator account now, again in IDMC, and I refresh the details for that user, you'll see that the account status is now disabled. So Azure can be used here in this sense to control whether an account in IDMC is enabled or disabled. Okay. So this is just a quick summary to show there are a couple of additional pieces of information and documentation that's available for configuring SCIM between IDMC and Azure Entra or Azure Active Directory. You can find more details by following that link. Also, if you have any additional feedback, any additional comments you would like to share, please feel free to reach out to us on the appropriate support channels. And if you have any issues with trying to get the integration to work, if you're having any errors from IDMC, you can always open a support ticket with GCS and one of our colleagues will help you. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed the session.